Hello students, you are about to engage in a three-part study of the Nuremberg trial. The three components include an analysis of what led to the Holocaust. Second, an evaluation of the Nuremberg trial and the moral basis for human rights, to see if those rights are determined by governments, or if human rights are discovered by reason, through the faculty of the human conscience. And third, an examination of contemporary bioethics and the connection between evolution, modern eugenics, and human rights. Oh, wait a minute students, I think I see someone who wants to say hello. Oh yes I do, and here he is.
Hey everybody. Yeah, it's Mr. B. How you doing? Miss me? I wish I could be with you, but that's not going to be the case. As I explained in the email, I tried to put together one unit with three parts that is for both CT1 and CT2 on the Nuremberg trial. And what I've done since CT1, the last assignment you really had was the critique of pro and con articles on morality. In CT2, you were looking at the justification for human rights in a legal trial, and it had to do with morals and how was that going to happen. So the first part that you have now is on the background of the Holocaust, and an analysis. How did Nazi Germany get to this point, apart from the economic situation? What is the worldview? What's the philosophy? How did it germinate? And how did it culminate in the Holocaust? And as you look at that, I've given you a handout to take some notes, and your assignment would be to answer some of the questions I've posed. Then the video takes a look at the United States and how education can transform government.
What served as the philosophical foundation that ultimately resulted in the Holocaust? If higher education becomes political indoctrination, then political indoctrination will result in government transformation. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist. He was arrested by the Nazis and was sent to their internment camp at Auschwitz, then transferred to the death camp at Kaufering. Frankl survived the Holocaust and wrote several books about his experiences. He wrote about his own sufferings at the hands of the Nazis. He wanted his readers to know what it was like to instantaneously lose your freedom, family, and self-respect. Now, I want you to imagine that you are one of the young people on a train, soon to be arriving at Auschwitz.
Scheiße, 35, 40, 45.
Goodness makers, what are the names?
Frankel analyzed the core issue and driving force that motivated the Nazis to systematically murder more than 10 million innocent men, women and children. He said, the Nazi gas chambers of Auschwitz were the final result of the theory that man is nothing but the product of genetics and environment, or, as the Nazis liked to say, the product of blood and soil. He said, I am absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Dachau were ultimately prepared, not in some branch of government in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Frankel's research took him to the place where abstract concepts germinate and ultimately can have devastating consequences. It is the place where the ideas for the Holocaust took root, with the end result being referred to as the final solution. Nietzsche's ideas took root in the mind of Hitler.
Every dictator needs a philosopher. So as Adolf Hitler took power in 1930s Germany, he cast about for his own version of Joseph Stalin's Karl Marx. He settled on Friedrich Nietzsche, the German genius madman who had been dead since the turn of the century. This was not an intellectual flight of fancy, but a deliberate act of statecraft, according to Ronald Biener, a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Nietzsche's writing about a future age of imperial politics in which a new caste would rule over Europe, recalling glorious empires of the past, was a blank check that Hitler was free to cash. And so in 1934, the new Führer was photographed at the Nietzsche archives in Weimar, and gave Nietzsche's younger sister Elizabeth a wreath for his grave, with the words, "To a great fighter." The next year, Hitler gave a set of Nietzsche's books to his ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini.
Nietzsche's ideas about the future age of imperial politics and a vision of glorious empires energized and inspired Hitler. Hitler viewed Nietzsche as a fellow fighter in his quest for world domination. Hitler said, I intend to set up a 1,000-year Reich, and anyone who supports me in this battle is a fellow fighter. So, Nietzsche's writing served as a philosophical foundation for Hitler. Next comes Darwin, who would provide Hitler with a scientific justification for his vision of a genetically superior master race. The cover of Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species, has no subtitle on the cover today. It was moved to the first page. However, when it was first published, the cover included the subtitle, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. In The Descent of Man, Darwin wrote the following: The Western nations of Europe greatly surpassed their former savage ancestors, and stand at the summit of civilization. At some future period, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace, throughout the world, the savage races. Darwin uses the term savages to indicate races of humanity with intellectual, cognitive limitations. He explains that the highest races and the lowest savages also differ in moral disposition. He referred to the intellectual and moral differences of these races as extreme. The idea that white people, Europeans, are the more civilized race and ought to be considered as intellectually and morally superior persists throughout his book. Darwin's ideas germinated in the mind of Hitler and eventually took root. Hitler cultivated those ideas and in 1925 published his book titled Mein Kampf. In it he wrote, "The stronger must dominate, and not mate with the weaker. For if such a law did not direct the process of evolution, then the higher development of organic life would not be conceivable at all. If nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such a case all her efforts to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being would be rendered futile." Hitler understood the power of an idea. He knew the right idea at the right time could be stronger than all the armies in the world. One of the primary objectives of the Nazi regime was to educate the next generation of German leaders. Hitler knew controlling educational institutes would secure the future of Germany. That is why he said, "Let me control the textbooks, and I will control the state." Well, students, I'm done for now. So, let me turn it over to Mr. B, who will introduce a look at educational transformation in the United States.
Hey everyone, I'm back. Miss me? So, we're at a point where at least there's a basic understanding of how the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche and the theory of evolution put forth by Darwin gave Hitler a rationale, a philosophical foundation, and a scientific motive to create this genetically superior race. And at this point, we're going to transition because we're going to see how there's similarities in the way education influences the Holocaust and in the way education has played an influence here in the United States with respect to shifting this whole country from a theistic, at least, framework to a materialistic, secular humanist framework. It didn't happen overnight. It took a whole generation to develop. But how did that happen? What took place to shift a worldview here? And we can see that. We'll see in a few minutes just by the major Supreme Court decisions of the last 60 years. Okay, that's it for now. Keep well. Godspeed. I'll be back.
Hello again, students. I am sure you are getting tired of this old man's voice. So, I am turning the narration of this topic over to my colleague Rachel.
Thank you, Peter. Good day, everyone. I am Rachel, and I will be your narrator for the balance of this video. Now, let's take a look at how higher education has changed in the United States and identify the root cause of that change. I think the best place to start is with Abraham Lincoln. Although Lincoln was self-educated, he understood the transforming power of academics, not only in a personal way, but also as a change agent to transform a nation. Abraham Lincoln aptly noted, "The philosophy in the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next." Now, what about the future of the United States? Albert Einstein said, "If you want to know the future, look at the past." Looking back to 1924, we can begin to see how the Scopes trial transformed higher education.
In 1924, Tennessee passed the Butler Act. The law prohibited the teaching of any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. John Scopes, a 24-year-old high school science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, objected to the law. With support from the American Civil Liberties Union, he taught his students Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. When word got out, Scopes was arrested and immediately brought to trial. The trial turned into a media circus. Besides every tabloid covering the event, it was the first trial ever to be nationally broadcast on the radio. The courtroom overflowed with people wanting to catch a glimpse of this historic trial. The ACLU hired esteemed lawyer Clarence Darrow to represent Scopes. Scopes was found guilty, but only received a $100 fine. Although Brian was victorious in the trial, Darrow won the war.
Christians won the battle at the Scopes trial, but lost the intellectual war for higher education. Instead of academically confronting Darwin's theory of evolution, they engaged in religious condemnation. The Scopes trial opened the door for secular humanism and the theory of evolution to enter into higher education. Gradually, Christian Ivy League schools were transformed into secular humanist institutions. Then, for the next 40 years, secular humanists educated a generation of future leaders. Those leaders became professors, lawyers, politicians, and judges who determined public policies. They also created legislation and made significant judicial decisions that favored the philosophy of secular humanism. The Scopes trial transformed higher education. Higher education taught a new generation. That new generation transformed government legislation. Starting in 1962, almost 40 years after the Scopes trial, the transformation begins. Removed class prayer, removed class Bible devotion, protected teaching macroevolution, removed right to life for the unborn, removed 10 commandments, teaching creation prohibited, ban lifted on fetal tissue research. Partial birth abortions declared lawful, public student prayers forbidden, sodomy laws declared unconstitutional, 10 commandments forbidden in court buildings, court-endorsed state law for assisted suicide, guaranteed nationwide right to same-sex marriage. After understanding our history, let's look at the present to get a glimpse of the future. The future of our society will be determined by the politicians who create our laws, and by the Supreme Court justices who ratify them. Higher education is no longer about the free exchange of ideas. It has been transformed into a systematic means of indoctrination. Students who graduate from these institutes will influence society through the various structures that govern it. Welcome to higher education. Now, meet your professors.
What are the 5 best reasons why there is no God? What are the 5 reasons why there are no fairies? The onus is not upon an atheist to say why there is not something. The onus is on a theist to say why there is. Having said that, it is a very interesting question, because a universe with a God would be a very different kind of universe than one without. So the most important reason is there simply are no reasons for the existence of a God. So the reasons against then would have to be you tick off on your fingers one by one the alleged reasons why there should be a God, such as the argument from design. Things look so beautifully designed, bananas and apples and things like that, and humans and kangaroos and so on. And they look as though they've been designed because that's what Darwinian natural selection does. It makes them look as though they're designed. It produces a very good simulacrum of design. I think that's the most important reason against, that Darwin has exploded once and for all the argument from design. What other arguments are there? The argument from first cause, well, that shoots itself in the foot, because if you're going to postulate a God as a first cause, you've then got a really big problem explaining where the God came from. The whole point of the Darwinian enterprise is that it explains how you can get complexity and the illusion of design from primordial simplicity. So the argument from first cause shoots itself in the foot. Pascal's wager you're better off betting that there is a God, because if you lose the bet, then you go to hell. That's a silly argument. Other reasons that have been offered, for example, people claim to have a subjective experience, a personal experience of God. Well, we all know how easily people are fooled. We all know how easily people hallucinate, how easily they imagine, how easily they dream. So that's an extremely poor argument in favor of the existence of a God. So there are no good arguments in favor of a God, and that's all one needs to say.
Dr. Michael Shermer is the founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine and the executive director of the Skeptics Society. And he's here today to discuss his book, Why Darwin Matters, the Case Against Intelligent Design.
One of the arguments the intelligent design theorists make is that certain structures are too complex to have come about by a stepwise, gradual Darwinian mechanism. Let's take DNA. Where did DNA come from? Well, we have some ideas it came from RNA. And well, where did RNA come from? Well, this sort of loose pre-RNA world, the origin of life researchers tell us. We don't really know the answer to this question yet. And so all the intelligent design theorists are doing is saying that we can't figure out how X came about naturally. Therefore, X came about supernaturally. End of story. We call this the God of the gaps argument, that wherever there's a gap in scientific knowledge, that is where the intelligent designer operated. Herbert Spencer in 1891 wrote, "Those who cavalierly reject the theory of evolution as not adequately supported by the facts seem quite to forget that their own theory is supported by no facts at all." So it's one thing to say that I can't figure out how X came about, and I'm not buying your natural explanation, you Darwinians or you neo-Darwinians or whoever. This is just an argument from personal incredulity, as Richard Dawkins calls it. It's just saying, I can't figure it out. Well, maybe you haven't figured it out yet because you're not smart enough, or maybe you haven't done the homework yet.
I'm going to talk about compassion and the Golden Rule from a secular perspective, and even from a kind of scientific perspective. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a natural history of compassion and the Golden Rule. So I do want to say at the outset that I think, compassion's great. The Golden Rule is great. I'm a big supporter of both. And I think it's great that the religions of the world, the leaders of the religions of the world, are affirming compassion and the Golden Rule as fundamental principles that are integral to their faiths. At the same time, I think religions don't deserve all the credit. I think nature kind of gave them a helping hand here. I'm going to argue tonight that compassion and the Golden Rule are, in a certain sense, built into human nature. Okay, so quick natural history of first compassion. In the beginning, there was compassion, and I mean not just when human beings first showed up, but actually even before that. I think it's probably the case that in the human evolutionary lineage, even before there were Homo sapiens, feelings like compassion and love and sympathy had earned their way kind of into the gene pool. And biologists have a pretty clear idea of how this first happened. It happened through a principle known as kin selection. And the basic idea of kin selection is that if an animal feels compassion for a close relative, and this compassion leads the animal to help the relative, then in the end, the compassion actually winds up helping the genes underlying the compassion itself. So from a biologist's point of view, compassion is actually a gene's way of helping itself, okay? So I warned you this was not going to be very warm and fuzzy, okay?
Was there pre-existing material for this extra spatio-temporal being to work with? Or did he just will it into existence, the ex nihilo? Who designed the designer? Don't you run the risk with the presumption of a God and a designer and an originator of asking, well, where does that come from, where does that come from, and locking yourself into an infinite regress?
9 million children die every year before they reach the age of 5. Okay, picture an Asian tsunami of the sort we saw in 2004 that killed 250,000 people. One of those every 10 days, killing children only under 5. Okay, it's 24,000 children a day, 1,000 an hour, 17 or so a minute. That means before I can get to the end of this sentence, some few children, very likely, will have died in terror and agony. Okay, think of the parents of these children. Think of the fact that most of these men and women believe in God and are praying at this moment for their children to be spared. And their prayers will not be answered. Any God who would allow children by the millions to suffer and die in this way, and their parents to grieve in this way, either can do nothing to help them or doesn't care to. He is therefore either impotent or evil.